The Palette of Narmer is a massive piece. As you can see, it's quite a bit larger than most people would assume, and it's actually a ceremonial palette. So being ceremonial, it's going to be larger, more elaborate, more formalized than what we typically see. And in terms of use, this would have been used or would have been meant as basically a makeup palette. And what we're looking at is really this indentation between the necks here, which would be used to mix the eyeliner, or was effectively eyeliner, that the Egyptians used. They use it for a reason. It's like eye black for baseball and football players. It would cut down the glare, especially if you're living in or near a desert. Glare is going to be a significant issue. And so it's not surprising that something that is so ubiquitous as this eyeliner or eye black that's used in Egypt, that these palettes would be quite common, and therefore it becomes a great ceremonial piece because everyone recognizes it. They know what it is, even though this one would have never actually been used. And it commemorates a historical event. This is also the earliest labeled work that we see, and it starts the formulaic representation of figures and forms. So we get that composite view in the figures, for example, most of them being chest towards us, feet and head facing to the side, giving us that profile view. Again, that question of relatability. And this shows the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, which actually likely took several centuries, but it's being credited to Narmer. On one side, Narmer wears the crown of Upper Egypt, the bowling pin on the other, he wears the crown of Lower Egypt. And what we see are, for example, the use of hieroglyphs to tell us that they're names. So here we have names. So Narmer's name, this man's name is there. Here we have probably the name of the foe that we were dealing with. And the whole thing is laid out in registers. On one side, we have Hathor. On the other side, we will see Horus, representing Upper and Lower Egypt once again in that idea of unification. The enemies are depicted rather brutally once again. We have the bodies tied up and we have their heads between their feet, giving us this sense of peoples who have been vanquished, but also peoples who were probably barbaric. You see they're not wearing clothing, or they don't appear to be wearing clothing. We're getting that sense of the enemy, the same sense that we had in Mesopotamia in the last chapter. This sort of subhumanization or dehumanization of the enemy is, again, quite common. These feline necks, sometimes I ran into someone at a county fair once who argued that these are dinosaurs, which is interesting. But this is stylized feline forms, probably lions of some form. The necks are intertwined, symbolic of, well, unification. The same reason we do things, we have a lot of intertwined imagery related to marriage when two people come together, etc. Same basic concept. And we see Hathor and Horus on this piece. So we see Hathor at the top. We see Horus represented by the falcon here. Again, that idea of the religion of Upper and Lower Egypt really coming together, because there were religious differences, or we believe there were religious differences. It also represents that both of the gods, this god of Upper Egypt and god of Lower Egypt, support Narmer and give him divine status. This is where the pharaoh becomes a god. The whole thing is done in low relief. So in other words, it's not carved very proud from the stone surface. And it is again broken into registers, giving us this idea of a narrative, or at least parts of a story. So for example, here we see Narmer directly involved, defeating the enemy. We see other defeated enemies underfoot. We've seen that sort of imagery before. Here we see the actual military campaign and this idea of unification and the idea of Hathor conquering, being the primary conquering god as it were, here. So, very interesting piece. We also see hierarchy of scale. Of course, the larger the figures, the more important they are. Narmer, being the most important, is always the largest figure when we see him. And tombs would provide our principal evidence for historical reconstruction of Egyptian civilization, especially early on. Although we have an advantage in Egypt, which is that it is very, very dry. And so we do have a lot more coming from Egypt than we do from some other societies, which gives us a leg up when we're discussing them. But pieces like this would have been found in a grave, and it would have been buried with the pharaoh for the same reason we have grave goods in the ancient and prehistoric world. Well, we're in the ancient world. The idea that this is commemorating something great that he did, that it's something that he might want to take with him into that afterlife.